Some of you may know this, but yesterday marked the 3rd anniversary of when Pastor Saeed was arrested in Iran. So he has now been in prison in Iran for 3 years because he preached the gospel. He was sharing the gospel with people, and they didn't like it. He was sharing the good news of Jesus, how people can come to have a right relationship with God by believing in Jesus. And they threw him in prison. And they have abused him. They have mistreated him for 3 years now. Now, I don't want to get into all the politics of it this morning, and there's a lot of it. But I want to stick to the main issue. And that is that he is suffering for Christ. He's suffering because he shared the gospel. Now, did he know that this could happen to him? When he went over there and when he opened an orphanage and when he started sharing the gospel openly with people, did he know this could happen to him? Absolutely, he knew it. But did it stop him? Of course not. Why? Because it was worth it. And it was right. It was the right thing for him to do, and it was worth it. You see, in his life, this was a priority. Sharing the gospel with people is a priority because he knew that these people needed to hear the truth about Jesus. He knew that they needed to come to a right relationship with God, and the only way to do that is through Jesus Christ. He knew that as he shared the gospel, more people could come to worship the exalted Christ. And he knew and knows that our commission from our Savior and Lord is to go and make disciples. You and I will probably never find ourselves in such an extreme situation as he is. Maybe, it's possible some of us may, and maybe someday that'll happen. Whether that's very likely or not, I want to say, what if, even now, if someone opposed you when you were sharing the gospel? If someone said, don't talk about Jesus, or you can't talk about Jesus here, what would you do? Would you let it stop you? Or would you continue to obey Jesus and tell people about him? Or what about if there's no direct opposition? And this is probably the experience most of us have. No direct or outright or over-the-top opposition. Will you share the gospel? Well, let me just put that in the present tense. Are you sharing the gospel? Are you telling people about Jesus? Are you in the process of building relationships with people and allowing them to see God working in your life so that you can share with them the truth about Jesus? Is the gospel a priority in your life? Now, I'm not asking if you have the gift of evangelism. I'm simply asking, is the gospel a priority in your life? And this morning we are going to ask 3 challenging questions that get to this. The gospel being a priority. And the first question is this: would you be willing to suffer for the gospel? Philippians chapter 1, verse 12 begins this way. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, we're going to come back to this, but first I want to see this. That he says, what has happened to me has caused the gospel to continue on, to grow, to move forward. It has advanced the gospel. But what has happened to Paul? What is he talking about? Well, Paul had been arrested for sharing the gospel. And I want us to take a look back at Paul's experience and his situation to see how this came about. You see, Paul had taken 3 missionary journeys. At the time he wrote this letter, he had already taken 3 journeys, 3 trips around to different cities where he would go and he would preach the gospel to people. And he went and he would share about Jesus with people. And so people could come to faith in Jesus and be saved and be reconciled to God. So he took these 3 journeys traveling around to tell people about Jesus. And at the end of the 3rd one, he said, I'm going back to Jerusalem. And so he did. He went back to Jerusalem. And when he went back to Jerusalem, he went into the temple. And when he was in the temple, some Jews saw him there, and they accused him of bringing Gentiles in the temple. Now, he hadn't, but that's what they accused him of. And the word got out, and the mob kind of came up, and mob mentality took over, and the mob started to attack Paul, and they were trying to kill him. Now, when they wanted to kill him, what the real problem was is that he'd been sharing the gospel. He had been going around and telling people to believe in Jesus. He'd even been telling Jews that they needed to believe in Jesus, that he was their Messiah. And they didn't like it. And so they were wanting to kill him because of his gospel message. Well, to continue the story, the Roman tribune who was in charge there at Jerusalem at the time came out, and he brought some soldiers, and they basically arrested Paul. But they arrested him. They really saved his life, in a sense, by arresting him, because the mob was still trying to get at him. Well, they arrest him, but the tribune, he assumes that Paul was an Egyptian troublemaker, an Egyptian revolutionary who had come up and had caused problems earlier, but it's not him. Paul's not him. But he assumes this, and he asks Paul and finds out later that he isn't. But when they come and they arrest him, the soldiers have to physically pick him up and carry him to protect him from the crowd, because they want to kill him. And so they carry him, and as they're carrying him back to the barracks, Paul asked for permission to stop and to speak to the people. You see, even as he's being arrested, even as they're trying to kill him, he wants to tell them about Jesus. And so he asked for permission to stop and to talk to them. And if you want to turn back to the book of Acts, just a few books to the left, in the book of Acts chapter 22, I want to read for you Paul's words. Acts chapter 22, beginning in verse 1. So Paul has been arrested, and he's standing there at the top of the steps, and he turns and he speaks to them. He says, brothers and fathers. He's addressing the other Jews and saying, hey, I'm one of you. I'm related to you. But he says, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, or the dialect, probably Aramaic, they became even more quiet and said, I am a Jew. And he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way, he's referring to the church when he says the way. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of the elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me, and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of who you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. You see, Paul starts telling them this story. When he has the opportunity to speak to them, he tells them his story, his testimony of how Jesus appeared to him. But you know what Paul is telling them? He's telling them the gospel. He's taken this opportunity to tell them about Jesus. Well, and then what happened? He speaks. They get upset. And they start yelling again. But he's telling them, you need to believe in Jesus. And look at verse 30. They had taken him back into the barracks. And in verse 30 it says, but on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he, being the Roman tribune, unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. So he says, I want to find out what's really going on. There's so much commotion. They're so anti-Paul. They're so upset him. I got to find out what's really going on. And so he says, I'm going to have a trial of sorts. So he brings them down, he sets them in front of the Jews, and he allows them to speak. So Paul speaks, and again, the Jews get mad at him, and they start arguing amongst themselves because he brings up the resurrection, and the two sects going to get in a fight. They start arguing amongst themselves, and it says that they almost tear Paul apart. They're so upset that they almost tear him apart. So look at verse 23. After this, he basically takes him back in custody, and he's going to send him on to someone else. But not verse 23, chapter 23, verse 11. It says, the following night, the Lord stood by Paul, and said, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. So Jesus says to him, just as you've testified and told people about me here, you're going to do it in Rome as well. Well, at this point, they're going to move Paul to someone else's custody, and he's going to be taken into the custody of Felix. And in verse 26, we have the letter he writes to Felix. He says, Claudius Lysias to his excellency, the governor Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. Now that's a little funny, because he didn't learn that he was a Roman citizen until after he saved him and after they were threatening to beat him. And Paul said, excuse me, is it right to do that to a Roman citizen without a trial? And they said, no, but the prefect here, or the tribune here, is really just trying to ingratiate himself to Felix when he writes this. He says, look, I saved his life, a Roman citizen. And verse 28 says, and desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but being charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And he goes on, he basically says, I'm going to send him to you. And so he does. And so then Paul goes to Caesarea, and he's held by Felix, and he's there for 2 years. And what has he done wrong? Nothing. Everyone says, I don't see that he's done anything wrong. This is the story that goes on and on. I don't think he's done anything wrong, but we'll keep him in jail. And so for 2 years, he's kept in prison. And then finally, at the end of that 2 years, Felix moves on, and he wants to do a favor for the Jews. And so he leaves them in prison. So the next guy comes along. And so now he's in the custody of a guy named Festus. And Festus goes, okay, I got to figure out what's going on here. And so he puts on a trial. And look at chapter 25, verse 9. Now the Jews had asked, can we bring him down to Jerusalem? And their plan is, if we bring him down to Jerusalem, we can kill him there. It's a whole lot easier. But look what happens. So Festus puts him on trial. Verse 9 says, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourselves know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. And so here's Paul put in this trial, and Festus saying, hey, you want to go down to Jerusalem? And Paul says, no, because he knows what they're planning. He knows what would be waiting for him. And so he ends up appealing to Caesar. Why does he appeal to Caesar? And I think a lot of times we ask this question. Wait, because Festus says, I know he hasn't done anything wrong, but he appealed to Caesar, so he'll go to Caesar. But Festus wasn't about to set him free. He was going to send him down to Jerusalem. So Paul appeals to Caesar, one, for a very practical reason, to stay alive. Because he knows what will happen. And so he says, no, I'll appeal to Caesar. In other words, keep me in your custody. Don't send me to Jerusalem. Send me to Rome. And I think there's a second reason, and that's a faith reason. Because Jesus had appeared to him and says, just as you testified about me here, you will testify about me where? In Rome. And Paul says, I believe he puts the two together and says, this must be the way I'm going to Rome. And he says, I appeal to Caesar. And so now he's headed to Rome to testify about Jesus in Rome. But Paul here was in prison for sharing the gospel. He's in prison for testifying about Jesus. And for over 2 years, he has sat in prison. And this will continue on. And he will continue to share the gospel. He will not stop just because he's in prison for doing it. He will continue to tell others about Jesus. And so when Paul wrote later on in his book, in the letter to Romans, in Romans 1:16 he wrote, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. When he wrote that, he meant it. He says, I'm not afraid. I'm not ashamed. I'm not embarrassed. He knew what it meant to not be ashamed of the gospel. He was not afraid to talk about the gospel. He was not afraid of what might happen or afraid to tell others. He was not embarrassed about this truth. And nothing could stop him from sharing it. But then he tells us why. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? He says, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. He says, it's the power of God. He says, this is so important because this is the only way people can come to be saved from their sins. This is the only way people can be reconciled to God, is by hearing about Jesus and believing in Jesus. Therefore, I've got to tell people. He says, I'm not ashamed because it's the power of God for salvation. It's so important because it's the only way that people can be saved. Every one of us is a sinner. Every one of us has disobeyed God. Every one of us, because of our sin, was separated from God, cut off from Him, and on our way to hell. And the only way to be rescued from that is by believing in Jesus. Jesus, who lived a sinless life and died on the cross in your place, taking the punishment that you deserved and that I deserved upon Himself, so that we could be forgiven and set free and reconciled, brought back into a right relationship with God, and made the children of God. This is the gospel that He is not ashamed of. This is the gospel that is so important that we share with others, because it is the only way to be saved. And so Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And then later he wrote a letter to Timothy saying, and he passes on this instruction to Timothy. In 2 Timothy 1:18, he says, therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me, his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. You see if it says that? He says, don't be ashamed. But he says, you know what? If it comes to it, be willing to suffer for the gospel. That means if you get thrown in prison, so be it. That means if people mistreat you, so be it. He says, be willing to suffer for the gospel. He says, keep telling people about Jesus. Keep sharing the gospel. Even if you suffer, even if you're mistreated, even if you're persecuted for it. And he says that God will give you the strength to endure it. And he says all this because, again, it's so important. It's the only way that people can be saved. But it's also important because this is what God asks of us as his children. So, are you willing, or would you be willing, to suffer for the gospel? To continue sharing about Jesus and trusting God no matter what? That's the challenge before us this morning. To make the gospel a priority in your life, no matter what, even if it means having to suffer. And that brings us to the second question. Will you be one of those who boldly proclaims the gospel? Back in the book of Philippians, chapter 1, verse 12 again reads, and I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. You see, the Philippian believers, they had been concerned about Paul's well-being. But not only were they concerned about Paul's well-being, they were concerned about the advance of the gospel, about the gospel ministry, that it would be hindered or stopped or hurt by Paul's imprisonment. You see, they may have been concerned or worried about this because they understood that if he was in prison, he was not free to travel, to make his missionary journeys. He's not free to move around and tell people about Jesus. And so they might be concerned then that he's not having the opportunity to tell people about Jesus because of his imprisonment. And not only that, they may be thinking that people might be embarrassed because of their association with a prisoner. That people wouldn't want to go on and share the same message that Paul shared because he was thrown in prison for it. And Paul's in prison. He's a criminal. He's there being held like he had done something wrong. So people might be embarrassed then to go and share the same message and be associated with them. And so the Philippians are concerned about this. And Paul first, as he writes his letter after he gets done with his thanksgiving and his prayer for them, the first thing he does is to alleviate their fears. He addresses this issue and he says that, because that his being in prison hasn't actually hindered the gospel message, but it has actually helped to advance the gospel message. In other words, the gospel, the truth about Jesus is getting out even more. So it's helped because it advanced the gospel because more people are hearing about Jesus. And some of those people who are hearing are people who are prominent, what you might call important or influential people. They're people who he might not have the opportunity to get to otherwise. So how has his imprisonment, his situation, furthered the gospel? He tells us two ways. In verse 13, we find the first one. He says, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. You see, his testimony has become widely known. People know why he's in prison. They know that he has a message that he's been telling about Jesus. And they know why he's in prison, that he's in prison for telling that message. And so he says, everybody knows that I'm not in here for doing something wrong. I'm in here for talking about Jesus or telling my testimony. And people know about it. They know his story. They know why he's in prison. They know the message. They've heard it. But who is it that knows? Who is it that has heard about his testimony? Like I said, they're influential people. They're people who he would have not likely come in contact with if he was not in prison. You see, he says it has become known to the imperial guard and the rest. The imperial guard, so the guard that is directly related to the emperor, and the rest. So other people in those circles. You see, Paul is now a prisoner of the emperor because he appealed to Caesar. He's going to Caesar. And he's now awaiting trial by Caesar, so he is an imperial prisoner. And so therefore he is guarded by the imperial guard, Caesar's private guard, his forces that live there in Rome. And so he's guarded by them. And not only that, but Paul would be chained to 2 soldiers at all times. And so you might think of Paul being a captive here, but really he has a captive audience. And he gets to share his testimony. He gets to share with people why he's there. And he gets to tell people about Jesus. And I can imagine Paul, every time someone, a different soldier or one that hasn't been in there before comes in, how he would get excited. All right, there's someone else I get to tell. And I can imagine. So they would sit there and he would tell them. And not only that, when people came to visit, they would hear him talking to them. And so people knew about his testimony. They knew why he was there. They heard the message. And we don't know how many of them believed. We don't know how many people in Rome believed. But we know that some did. In fact, if you turn to Philippians chapter 4, the very end of Philippians, when Paul is giving his greetings, chapter 4, verse 22, he says this, "All the saints greet you." Now catch this. "Especially those of Caesar's household." You know, the imperial guard and the rest. Those who are of Caesar's household, those who are connected to Caesar. So some very influential people came to faith in Jesus Christ as a result of his ministry and as a result of his imprisonment. Then he tells them the second way that his imprisonment has furthered the gospel in verse 14. He says, "And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." So other Christians now have started trusting in Jesus more and sharing the gospel more openly. In fact, he's saying that they've been motivated by my imprisonment to go out and talk about Jesus even more and more openly. Now this may seem odd because you might think, well, they're more bold to do the very thing that got Paul thrown in prison. And in a way, it doesn't make sense because, that means that they're saying, well, I should go. I mean, how does the fact that he got thrown in prison make me want to go do it and run that same risk? So it may seem a little odd, but here's what's happening. You see, Paul's bold stand for Christ, his bold testimony, has encouraged others to do the same. His suffering for Jesus Christ has become an example and an inspiration to other believers. If Paul can do it, we should do it too. That's what we're supposed to do. Let's go do it. And they have been inspired by him and move forward. Now let me give you a more modern example of this kind of thing. Many years ago, a man named Jim Elliot and 4 other men went down to Ecuador to share the gospel with the native people there. And they found a strip of sand, a sandbar that they could land their plane on. And they landed their plane there. And they went and they made contact with the native people so they could share the gospel with them. And those people came and killed them. And these 5 men all died on that sandbar in Ecuador. But since that day, I don't know how many people have been motivated to go out and to give up their lives for Christ, to share the gospel with others, because they saw their example and said, I want to be like that. I want to live for Christ like that. That doesn't mean they were going out and saying, yes, I want to get killed. Yes, I want to be thrown in prison or whatever the example may be. But they said, I want to go out and live for Christ. I want to give my life for him. And if that means I suffer, it means I suffer. But I'm boldly going to go proclaim his name. And many people have come to faith in Jesus as a result of those 5 men's death. and all the people who have followed in their footsteps of going onto the mission field and sharing Jesus Christ. Or even those who have been bold to proclaim his name even at home. You see, that's what happened in Paul's day. He says that many, actually he says most of the brothers have more confidence in Christ. They're more bold because of my imprisonment. They're no longer afraid. It's not because they think, oh, nothing can happen to me. But it's because they're trusting Jesus. And they've decided, I'm going to do what's right. And I'm going to share the good news of Jesus. So will you trust God rather than fear what people can do to you? Will you be one of those who boldly proclaims the gospel? And now we come to the third question, and it's this. Is sharing the gospel a prominent part of your life? At this point in his letter, Paul makes a bit of a concession because he says, hey, things are going great. The gospel is advancing. But there is one little issue. And we find that in Philippians chapter 1, verse 15 and following. He says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. You see, great things are happening. But not all of it is being done for the right reason, with the right motivations. People are sharing the gospel. And when I say this, I believe he's talking about the real gospel, the true gospel. Because he says that Christ is being proclaimed. They're proclaiming Christ, and he says, and I have joy, or I rejoice because of it. And so he is saying this has to be the true gospel that is being proclaimed, because otherwise he'd not be rejoicing. He would say something more like what he says in Galatians, where he says, if anyone, whether myself or anyone else, preaches a gospel different than the one you've already heard, let him be accursed. In other words, let him be condemned to hell. We don't find those kinds of words here. And so they're talking about the real gospel. These people are going out and they're teaching the gospel. They're telling people about Jesus. They're doing the right things. But all of these people who are sharing the gospel fit into one of two groups or two categories. The first group, they are doing it out of love. They're doing it for the right reasons. He says, this group, they understand that Paul is in prison according to the will of God. That God has put him there for a reason. And they understand that they are in partnership with Paul in the gospel ministry. And they say, if Paul can do it, I'll do it too. And so they're in partnership with him. And they do it out of love, meaning they do it because they love God, because they love Jesus, because they love Paul, because they love people. And people need to hear the gospel. And so they do it for the right reasons. And then the second group, we're told that they do it out of rivalry. And I'm going to tell you, they created some sort of rivalry. It wasn't Paul. Paul never said, hey, there's me and then there's everyone else. And I'm in a contest with you. There was no rivalry. Paul wasn't doing that. But these people created some sort of rivalry with Paul. And for some reason, they see themselves as being in competition with the Apostle Paul. And for some reason, they think that if they share the gospel and lead people to Christ, that it will bother Paul, that it will upset him for some reason. In fact, Paul uses the word afflict, that they think that if they do this, they will afflict me in my imprisonment. In other words, that they will make his imprisonment even harder. Now, it's hard to understand why they think that this might upset Paul. I mean, Paul wants people to hear about Jesus. He wants people to believe in Jesus and be saved. He wants people to be reconciled to God. So why would he be upset if people are coming to Christ? Well, he wouldn't, and he says, I rejoice. But for some reason, they think he will. Now, it appears that these people are envious of Paul. And maybe envious of his ministry, of all that he has done, of how God has used him. And so now they're trying to make Paul jealous and try to discourage him. See, the thought is, if I go out and share the gospel with people while Paul is stuck in prison and can't do it, then I'm winning. And maybe he'll get jealous. And see, if they obviously didn't know that Paul's sharing the gospel with everyone he comes in contact with in prison. But they think, if I go out and do this while he can't, then he'll get discouraged. He'll be upset. And the Spirit, maybe they're also trying to gain a following for themselves. We see there a little bit of that in Corinthians where Paul says, where some people say, I'm of Paul and I'm of Apollos and I'm of Peter, And maybe they're trying to gain a following for themselves. But see, the thing is when we share the gospel, we don't share the gospel to gain a following for ourselves. When we tell people about Jesus, we do it to gain a following for Jesus. It's not about me. It's not about us. It's all about Jesus. But the funny thing is, when I go to a gathering of pastors, very often the conversation starts with something like, oh, where are you from? Oh, how big is your church? And I have to admit, a lot of times it feels like a competition. And sometimes you have a group of people in one church who start talking about another church. And a good church, a church that is preaching the gospel, a church where people are being saved. And the people at this church start talking about that church and complaining about them or talking about all their weaknesses without looking at their own weaknesses. But they start complaining about this other church and saying, well, look, people shouldn't go to that church. I don't want to ever hear someone say that about a good Bible-believing, Bible-teaching church. That wasn't a scolding, by the way. It just came out. But it happens. And people will complain about other churches. Again, as if it's a competition. And then you'll have even groups within a church, one church, who will kind of hold to, well, I go to this class, and I sit under this teacher. And we will compare teachers, and we will say, well, this one's better, and that one's worse. And I've even heard people say, not here, but I've even heard people say things to this effect. That guy's boring. You should not go to his class. And I want to ask, is he teaching the truth of Scripture? Is he telling people about Jesus? Then you should not tell anyone he should not go to hear from the Word. But it sure seems a lot of times like we are in a competition. But I want to tell you something about Bible-believing, Bible-teaching churches. Gospel-believing, gospel-teaching churches. We are not in competition. We are working together. And some churches have strengths in one area and weaknesses in another, and other churches have strengths in that area and weaknesses there. But we are working together to raise up a following for Jesus. We are working together to get the gospel out, to make disciples of Jesus. Now back to Paul's opponents. Whatever the exact motive was for what they were doing, whatever the reason they thought they could upset Paul, it didn't work. It didn't annoy him. He wasn't upset by it. You see, because Paul says, as long as Jesus is proclaimed, as long as the true gospel is being preached, I will rejoice about that. If we hear about a church where hundreds of people have saved, we should not say, man, why did they go there? We should rejoice about that. And if we should do anything, we say, why not here? But we should rejoice with each other when the gospel goes out. As Christians, the gospel is so central to who we are, so central to what life is about. And that's what we see in Paul when he says, for whatever, I rejoice. Jesus is proclaimed, I rejoice. If Christ is proclaimed, it's good. And we see in Paul that his life was consumed with the gospel. And you may not be exactly the same as Paul. I mean, I don't know that many people are. But does it bring you joy to hear Jesus proclaimed? Does it bring you joy when you hear about others sharing the gospel? Does it bring you joy when you hear about people coming to faith in Jesus Christ? You see, the gospel is central to who we are. And you may not be a missionary, you may not be a pastor, you may not be an evangelist. In fact, you may say, I'm a plumber, I'm an accountant, you may be a Marine, you may be a salesman, and I could go down the list of every occupation I could think of. You may be retired. But is sharing the gospel a prominent part of your life? You see, as followers of Jesus, it is primary. It is central. The gospel is central to all we are and do. In fact, without the gospel, we have nothing. Oh, sure, we may enjoy some of the fleeting pleasures of this world. But without the gospel, there's no substance. There's no abundant life. There's no eternal life. We're cut off from God. Without the gospel, we have nothing. A church without the gospel is just a deceptive gathering. If there is a church that does not preach the gospel, then all they're doing is they have an appearance of spirituality, but they're missing it. And they may lead people away from God rather than to Him. Just like Paul said of the Pharisees, you blind guides. He says, you lead people and they become twice the son of hell. Because you've led people away from God rather than to Him. But we know that there is only one way to be saved. There is only one way to be brought into a right relationship with the Father, and that is through Jesus Christ. And people need to know it. People need to hear the truth about Jesus. People need to hear the gospel. No matter what happens to us, people need to hear that truth. So whatever you do with your days, however you support yourself or support your family, whatever your vocation or your calling, and there are many different ones, but whatever your vocation or calling is, we all have one commission. Go and make disciples of Jesus.